Hmm. What if the greatest challenge facing our community is not a lack of vision, but, but a lack of leadership willing to sustain it? We're going deep this morning, y'all. Good morning, and welcome to Disrupting Poverty Through Leadership That Delivers Results AM Talk Show. I'm your host, Dr. Tekemia Dorsey, and today we're stepping back to examine the bigger picture. Agenda 2030, sustain sustainable leadership, systems transformation, and the future we are building right now. Because the decisions leaders make today will shape communities for generations. Prayerfully. Today's episode is titled Agenda 2030 and the Future of Leadership. Building sustainable systems that leave no one behind. That latter part sounds familiar, right? Okay, stay focused. Agenda 2030 is more than a global framework. It is called to leadership. It is a call to leadership, a call for governments, educators, businesses, nonprofits, workforce systems, healthcare leaders, and communities to align around one shared mission: ending poverty, reducing inequality, expanding economic opportunity, strengthening communities, protecting future generations. And perhaps the most powerful phrase connected to Agenda 2030 is this: leave no one behind. But leaving no one behind requires intentional leadership. And it might sound a little cliche, but is it possible? Sure, it is, if we all come together. Let's by examining why Agenda 2030 matters at the local level. Most people hear Agenda 2030 and assume that it only applies internationally. But the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, directly impact schools, workforce systems, healthcare systems, housing policies, transportation systems, community investment strategies. And I'm wondering, before my podcast, has anyone even heard of Agenda 2030 that's not working on an international level? Or how Agenda 2030 is applicable to the state level and the local level? Never mind. It doesn't matter because guess what? Now you should be a little more familiar with what Agenda 2030 is, its impact internationally, globally, state, and locally. A local community college struggled with low workforce participation, housing instability, educational inequities, because different agencies work independently. But when leadership align efforts across sectors, outcomes improve significantly. In other words, that cross sector collaboration. Because the truth is, global goals only become real through local leadership and implementation. So, Agenda 2030, in other words, cannot be successful internationally or globally if it's not done on the state level with all of these agencies, cross sector, multiple agencies working together, but it begins on the local level. Here, you and I, everyone together. But Oftentimes, in theory, it sounds good, and in practical application, it falls completely apart. And local leadership becomes the driving force behind sustainable systems, right? Agenda 2030 requires leadership at every level, regardless of titles, regardless of what part. Everyone is born a natural leader. Now, some people get better over time because they conform to the leadership models, strategies, methodologies, belief systems that help shape their moral ethics, values, and all those great things. But nevertheless, everyone is a leader, elected or not. But it's not what you are, it's what you do. And as a leader, if you are moving the needle a little bit, whether it's in your home, your community, your business, your environment, your relationship, that's moving the needle forward because eventually you're going to impact others around you, right? And we're not just talking elected officials. Parents are leaders, educators are leaders, advocates are leaders, community organizers are leaders, and young people are leaders, right? I hate the phrase students, children are leaders of tomorrow. No, students are leaders of today. You just got to recognize the leadership in them and their leadership potential to really come alive. A local community parent consistently advocated for educational equity and healthcare accountability. At first, as usual, the voice was ignored, right? But over time, community awareness increased. Other families joined in. Leadership was forced to respond. Leadership is not about a position, it's about responsibility and action. And oftentimes, when people's voices aren't heard at first, they want to quit. Been there, done that. Because we feel like no one cares. And then spirit reminds you, or something in the community, or something happens as to why the voice should have never stopped. So if you are a parent or an advocate or community organizer or anyone that feels like you're advocating for something important and the movement isn't happening yet, don't stop. Keep pushing because oftentimes any and everyone jumps on a one hit wonder bandwagon. But the consistency is what people begin to notice, right? And then they know that you're serious and not out for a spotlight. So keep pushing. But systems do not transform through isolated efforts. Agenda 2030 emphasizes partnerships for the goals. And that SDG number is 17. So SDG 17 is partnership for the goals. Because poverty cannot be disrupted through disconnected systems. Like if you've been following me over the last week, my double sump pump stopped working. And my basement fell apart. And then the water mitigation came in to stabilize the basement. The plumber came, but as the plumber was going through my double sump pump, which fried itself out, one sump pump went in. Then the plumber noticed that there was a problem with my piping. So at the end of the day, the plumber left the sump pump unconnected, disconnected, right? And my number one question to the plumber was, listen, water mitigation just came in here and cleaned up my floor, waiting to move on, right? Is my floor going to flood? Because I can't have that. The plumber was like, no, it shouldn't. Again, sump pump in a tank, in a well, pipes disconnected. He was going to come back the next morning when water mitigation got here so that water mitigation can take the little bit of water left in a tank and finish building my sump pump. Well, lo and behold, because of these disconnected systems, water mitigation gets here first thing Sunday morning, and guess what? My floor is flooded again. So when we're talking about the fact that poverty cannot be disrupted through disconnected systems, and that takes multiple people, multiple agencies, from multiple backgrounds, compare it to disconnected pipes. A sub pump disconnected from its origin in its pipes, and what happens if it's not turned on and properly installed? Exactly, right? A workforce program partner had partnered with local schools, transportation agencies, healthcare providers, and employers. But instead of addressing one issue at a time, they address interconnected barriers together. Well, that's an epic fail because there is no way to address more than one issue, get sound outcomes, and ones that are measurable and where data can be collected to see what worked. The result, as in this scenario, because they address interconnected barriers that they were all centered on, they improve retention, they had better workforce outcomes, and increased economic stability because when you're thinking about employers, when you're thinking about healthcare agents, healthcare providers, when you're thinking about transportation agencies and local schools, they all have commonalities, right? Least common denominators to barriers. So instead of them isolating or working on these barriers in a silo perspective, they decided to work on their barriers together, which means that they're looking at it through different angles, but it's the same issue that would yield positive outcomes. And it worked: improve retention, better workforce outcomes, increase stability. Because systems thinking changes outcomes because people do not experience barriers at one time. Had my water mitigation company not left before my plumber finished, the systems would have been connected, right? That would not have been they wouldn't have been working in ice in silo. My basement wouldn't have flooded again. But because water mitigation left, plumbing didn't finish, by the time we came back, they were now upset because water mitigation not only had to do it all over again, but they lost their equipment. Plumbing should have let them know and asked them to stick around or whatever. So the more that organizations work together and build that systems pipeline, action, thinking, behavior, everything improves. And leadership must move from short term reaction to long term sustainability. Saturday's cleanup shouldn't have been a Sunday mess up, right? It should have moved things along in the piping pipeline. But everybody was thinking in their own individuality. And in life, it happens. And many systems focus on immediate outputs. For my water mitigation company, their immediate output was to stop the flooding, get the water out the floor so that the plumber could come in. The plumber immediate reaction was get this up pumping, but then when he ran into problems, it became a problem and then a bigger problem for everyone else. And many systems focus on immediate outputs, such as quarterly results, temporary funding cycles, short term visibility. We see it and it happens all the time. But Agenda 2030 requires long term thinking, like fixing the sump pump so it doesn't burst anymore or failure, or soaking up water for mitigation and not having to go backwards but to move forward. Yes. So that long-term thinking is what Agenda 2030 requires. A local city invested in youth leadership development, financial literacy, housing stability, and workforce readiness simultaneously, right? 10 years later, crimes decreased, graduation rates improved, workforce participation increased. Long term, short term impact, decision making, long term sustainability. So, sustainable leadership builds systems that continue producing results over time. But sustainability also requires accountability, right? Leadership without accountability creates stagnation. Agenda 2030 challenges leaders to measure poverty reduction, educational outcomes, workforce mobility, healthcare access, equity indicators. An organization recently shifted from measuring participation numbers to measuring long term mobility outcomes. Well, they're ahead of the time. And in that shift from measuring participation numbers to long term mobility numbers, the funding became a priority, their leadership strategy shift, and their community partnerships were impacted because what gets measured gets prioritized. And this is where most organizations fail because they are measuring numbers, they are measuring the output that they seek versus the impact. And if they don't know any better, they keep doing the same thing. But if we're really going to be able to look at the dent, the measurement, the needle being moved, move from numbers and move to long-term mobility outcomes. Are you moving from one funder to two or one to five, right? Is your leadership strategy allowing you to hire or have succession planning or involve in more professional development, right? In community partnerships, are you still at 3? Did you increase to 10? Those are long-term mobility outcomes because the more that you're adding, that means that you're moving in the right direction. And finally, Agenda 2030 requires hope backed by action. You can't sit around a table month after month, week after week, year after year, and do nothing, right? It requires action, input, events, partnerships, planning, investment, all of those things. Communities do not respond to empty promises at all. They need courageous leadership, they need coordinated systems, they need public accountability, and consistent action, right? What are you doing? When was the last time you did something? Hope matters, but leadership turns hope into measurable change. People need to see that you're doing something that they can be a part of and get involved in all of those great things, right? So, as usual, let's bring this into action. Here is your leadership challenge. Identify one area where your leadership can align with Agenda 2030 goals. Yes, you're going to have to do some research, either rewind back to the other 20 something episodes thus far to learn what Agenda 2030 is, or use the internet for what it is to Google it, get involved, figure out what works, what happens, what's your interest, what's your flavor, but identify where your leadership can align with Agenda 2030 goals. Build one new partnerships that strengthens system collaborations, preferably around that alignment with an Agenda 2030 goal that matches your leadership interests, right? And then commit to one measurable action that creates long term community impact. Because here's the truth, and we know we love the truth, right? The future is not created by intention alone, it is created by leaders willing to build sustainable systems that protect people, expand opportunity, and leave no one behind. And leaders who embrace that responsibility becomes transformational forces in their communities. Pin drop. So, if this episode challenged and inspired you, follow Disrupting Poverty Through Leadership That Delivers AM Results AM Talk Show. Share one Agenda 2030 goal that connects to your work or leadership. Drop it below. And tag a leader committed to sustainable systems change and measurable impact. Because Agenda 2030 is not just a framework, it is a leadership responsibility, and it's your responsibility. Thanks for tuning in for another wonderful episode. If this motivated you, download, subscribe, um, rewind, take notes, send it in your network, pause, listen to the audio, but most importantly, get into action. Don't take the leadership challenges for granted. Don't take Agenda 2030 like it's over the head, because remember, Agenda 2030 may have been created internationally, but it's a trickle down, right? International, global, state, and local. And here we are impacting local to support global. Well, thank you. I'll see you in the next episode. Have a great day. And with anything else, be blessed.